University who work with me in the HfE North American Observatory. And the presentation today builds on projects that were innovated in HfE's first stage of operation from 2013 to 2015. One of these projects was Dinner 2040, which was led by Joan McGregor and which imagined and designed community mileposts for arriving at a more desirable food future in the year 2040 in the Phoenix Salt River Valley. And the other was the Archive of Hope and Cautionary Tales led by Sally Kitch, which was accompanied by a set of principles for considering environmental justices and injustices. So you'll see some of these elements in the new project, which they present today. And namely, these elements include some mileposts and a set of design principles that seek to transform information into action for a brighter food future for us all. Now, the presentation that you'll hear about today was actually published in the journal Humanities in April 2021, and I believe Stephen Hartman was maybe the co-editor of that. Stephen, you can tell us if you were or not. But
yeah.
Okay, good. The article is called, it's the same title as the name of the panel, Gendered and Racial Injustices in American Food Systems and Cultures. It's an open access article, so I invite you to go find it in the journal Humanities, volume 10, number 66, April 2021. Today, each panelist is going to explore various dimensions of racialized and gendered injustices in food systems and cultures in the United States. And each of the panelists will present principles of a critical and systemic design. And then lastly, they will invite you, each of the members of the audience, to comment on the design principles and think with them about whether or not these principles might work in other regions and contexts, including Taiwan. So now quickly, let me introduce each one of our panelists and tell you a little bit about what they work on at Arizona State University, and then I'll turn the time over to Sally Kitch. Sally Kitch is a Regents Professor and founding director of the Humanities Lab and the Institute for Humanities Research at ASU. She's also a distinguished global futures scientist. She's written 3 books on feminism and utopianism and developed that as a subfield of feminist theory. Her most recent work involves the resistance of Afghan women, leaders to their country's gender ideology. She's also been active in the Consortium for Humanities Centers and Institutes, through which resulted 2 Mellon Foundation grants that helped to establish the HfE, Global Network of Observatories, which convenes us here. So of course we have to sort of honor her for making sure that we're all here. This is one of the reasons why we're here. Joan McGregor is faculty head and professor of philosophy in the School for Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at ASU, and she's also an affiliate of the Global Futures Lab. Her current research project is directing a project called Just Food, which is a multiple-year transdisciplinary project designed to research moral and cultural questions related to modern food production and consumption. She also, as I mentioned a minute ago, led the HfE Dinner 2040 project. Mauricio Mejía is an associate professor of design and assistant director of research and knowledge enterprise for the design school at Arizona State University. His current work is about strategic design and theories of change, and he often collaborates with practitioners and researchers in other fields such as health, sustainability, business, and education. Dr. Mejía studies and works with diverse current and emergent design practices and approaches such as design research, visual sense making, service design, experience design, co-design, and design futures. Sara Al-Said is assistant professor in the School of Sustainability and co-director of the Biomimicry Center and assistant research professor at the Sweetie Center for Sustainable Food Systems at ASU. She's also a Global Futures Scholar, and I should mention that everybody I'm introducing today is a Global Futures Scholar, in case I forget that part. Sara's research interests include exploring ways to have more regenerative and net positive local food systems, and she's the co-founder of several enterprises in Egypt, including Nawaya, a social enterprise working as a catalyst to transition small-scale farmer communities into more sustainable ones through education and research. And that's just only one of the enterprises she works with. There are several more. Sara is also on the board of Slow Food and an international movement that started in Italy. Christy Spackman is an assistant professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and the Herberger Institute of Design and Arts at ASU, and she's also a global future scientist. She studies the environmental and social impact of scientific and technological efforts to manipulate sensory experiences of smelling and tasting. The recipient of fellowships at New York University and the École Normale Supérieure, as well as fellowships from the Social Science Research Council, the Mellon Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies. She's writing, Christy, you can tell us if this is a book or an article, Making Nothing, the 20th Century Transformation of Water. Is that a book?
Yes, it's a book.
Okay, she's writing that book. And finally, Juliann Vitullo is Associate Professor of Italian in the School of International Letters and Cultures at ASU, and she's co-director of the Humanities Lab and a Global Futures Scholar. She currently is researching the history of translocal traditions, collectively defined as varieties of the Mediterranean diet, and the different ways they are translated into other cultures. Her research and community-based teaching emphasizes the importance of preserving the cultural and ecological knowledge of traditional and indigenous foodways, including those of the Southwest, where she lives and teaches for a more equitable and sustainable future. Please join me in welcoming my wonderful colleagues, and I'll turn the time over to Sally Kitch now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joni, for that introduction. Our title slide does reinforce the fact that our presentations are very much located in the United States context. And as Joni said, one of the things that we're interested in through this presentation is whether the principles that we identify in terms of injustices, as well as the principles for addressing those injustices, might apply in other contexts. This is a multi-authored paper, the one that Joni was mentioning, and presentation. And I think that we are hoping to be a sort of model of collaboration. That is, we are coming from different perspectives, different disciplinary perspectives and theoretical perspectives perhaps, but we have worked through our individual presentations in terms of trying to find commonalities and working with the materials that our colleagues have also presented. So at the end, you will hear that we have adopted some design principles that apply to our individual approaches to injustice, but also, we hope, to the whole problem of food injustice. So you will hear from each of us, but at the end, we will be putting this together. So we thought you might like to know what we mean by food injustice. I'm sure there are other ways of looking at it, but these are sort of the basic principles that we have identified. It has to do with access and the way labor and food production and consumption is distributed. We also are coming from an industrialized food system that we believe damages both the environment and individual health and well-being. So these are some of the principles that we're working from in terms of injustice. And we believe that these impacts are severe. And we want to have upfront the idea that these actually damage not only the environment, but individuals who are participating in the kind of diets that have come to be known as the American diet. So we'll be speaking from these perspectives as we identify our individual approaches to the concept of food injustice. With that, I'm turning the time over to Joan McGregor.
Okay, thank you, Sally, and thank you, Joni, for the beautiful introduction. And I'm very honored to be a part of this panel today. let me see if I make sure I take control. Yeah, so this is, this has been a collaboration, but I think, we're coming at this problem of food injustices and trying to understand them. I'm a moral, legal, and political philosopher. And so trying to think about the notion of injustice, what does it mean? How do we understand those as injustices, and how do we understand who's responsible for them? So that's where I'm, coming at this problem. And so can everyone see that slide, the change in slide? I hope so. Yeah, so what I wanted to try to explore is, how is it that we understand the sort of differential impact of our food system? Why is it that the food system, and again, I'm mainly talking about in the US context, we'll hear if this is true in other contexts, where some populations, some communities are being much more severely harmed than other ones. It's not to say we all don't suffer some harms from this system, but we really have a kind of disparate impact. And so I look at an example like this example that I've got here, which comes from a story from The Guardian about food deserts in the United States. And so we have this woman, Dolores Bateman. She's a single mother of 5 children. She lives in South Memphis, a predominantly African-American neighborhood, without supermarket access on, supermarket access is difficult, right? On foot for most, people who live there. She's a janitor in an elementary school, so she relies on public transport to get to her job and to the grocery store, which is a 45-minute ride from her home. So as many people in the United States, since her income's low, she does get federal free breakfast and lunch for her kids at school. But one of the problems with those lunches and breakfasts is they're often, though they include, many nutrients, they're often high in sugar, fat, and salt. And they're often pretty highly refined. Does everyone see it? Sara, you said, can you see the slide? Yes?
I can see it, yes.
Oh, okay. I thought I saw
But
something in the chat.
I had to click on one of the boxes to get it.
Okay. Well, let me know if you can't see it. I can move it along if you need to. So again, we often see in many of these communities, we see very high incidence of diabetes, heart disease, and even particularly in children. So it's pretty shocking. You'll have communities where half the population has diabetes. Some of these neighborhoods also are very underinvested and historically were products of redlining. And in the United States, redlining was, if you're not familiar with that, that was a practice that was done starting in the 30s, where they would actually literally, draw a red line on a map and say, we're not loaning money to the people in those neighborhoods. And so people then couldn't get mortgages for houses, couldn't invest in businesses, and so on. So you have many of these kind of lower income minority neighborhoods that are products of this historical discrimination. It's no longer, you can no longer redline neighborhoods, but in fact, there's a kind of history of that from that. So, Dolores's neighborhood is a neighborhood which we would call a food desert, right? And a lot of people are actually terming this now as a food apartheid. And that is a human-created systems of segregation that relegate some groups to kind of inferior food systems and others to have opulence. So, but these are generally neighborhoods or areas in which there's no access to fresh fruits and vegetables, higher quality foods. There'll be a lot of fast foods and so on. That's what we started with that early slide where we saw the kind of food, what are called food swamps, right? So the question is, often the way in which this gets framed is that, look, these aren't injustices because people make choices. We live in a market economy. People are free to make choices. And part of what I'm interested in looking at is if in fact, what is the background conditions within which Dolores is making her choices? So is it the case that she has the same, what I refer to as opportunity set as other people in other communities, right? So if you look at, here she is living in this community, and some of the background conditions that are limiting her food options are a red line neighborhood. Again, it's no longer red line, but there's a historical consequences of that redlining, which means we've got an underinvested neighborhood. Grocery stores don't go in there. There aren't playgrounds. The schools are underfunded and so on. We also have something that a lot of people are actually terming as public transit kind of injustices. The transportation system isn't as good, right? And then we have social norms. And this is where, when we look at these background conditions, it's not all laws, policy, regulations. We have norms. And this is something that Sally Kitch is going to pick up on, I think, as well. Is so there are norms about proper roles of women, right? So what are proper career choices? Like you might say, why does she take one job rather than another job, right? Which tend to be lower paid jobs. And so those are because of sort of gendered norms in society that relegate women to certain jobs and not other ones, and also relegate them to being sole caregivers of children, right? This is a issue whether or not you're in a sole family, one parent family, or two parent family. And we also have then other conditions that dictate the food choices. Are the US government has since the 30s been subsidizing commodity crops, particularly things like corn and soy, leading to sort of dumping these very inexpensive but low nutrition products on the market. And then we get, all this kind of junk food that's made from it, right? So that becomes cheaper than the higher quality foods. So again, that's a kind of government policy that wasn't designed to sort of, harm certain populations and not others, but the consequence of that policy has led to this, particularly when you're in a neighborhood where all your access is to this low quality food, right? Cheap, low quality food. And then I think, kind of maybe even more globally, we have this global corporate food system that, kind of, engineers food. I was just talking to my class the other day. It's like, who doesn't like, some of these junk foods? I mean, they're engineered with the salt, sugar, fat, combo to sort of light up in our brains like heroin. So it's been engineered, and then it gets sold to kids as early on on TV and other media sites. So the question is, here's Dolores trying to make choices for her family. And when people say, oh, well, it's a free choice, right? She could choose to do otherwise. The question that I was interested in thinking about is she really in the same choice situation as somebody else? And is it right to say that she is, is responsible for those outcomes, right? And so that's where, we get to this question of, because the retort is, these are not injustices. People make choices, and if they make bad choices, then it's their fault. It's their responsibility. If you say, no, it's not their choice, they don't have the options, they don't have the kinds of conditions that other people do. And as I'm arguing, that these are background social structures, that is, rules, policies, norms that are part of our socially constructed environment that we maintain, that those, and as an outcome, this gives the options that people have, or other one options, or not other options. And so then it becomes a matter of justice and not just a matter of choice or just bad luck. That's another people say, well, it's just bad luck. If you live, some people live someplace, some people get lucky and some people don't. But what I'm trying to argue is that these are really products of background collective social arrangements that we maintain, even if we do so unwittingly, right? And that's one of the things that was really interested in this, is because, and again, I come at this kind of from a moral philosopher and a legal philosopher, and normally, for example, in the law, we have a kind of liability model of responsibility. So, A hits B, so A is responsible for B's harm. But in this case, or, we have a racist actor who does something bad to somebody of, a particular race, then we can say, you have discriminated. The argument that I'm trying to make here is that a lot of these background structures, it's not as if there are sort of active racists trying to harm this community. It's rather that we've set up some structures in place. For example, a market economy that values efficiency in food production over everything else, right? You might have a system that the value of the food system was to provide healthy, environmentally sustainable, culturally appropriate food, right? You could have that, and then that would alter the outcomes. So if you work for, Kellogg's, and you're trying to, your job is to make sure that you provide efficient food that you can sell a lot of, then the fact that this is the outcome may not be directly attributable to sort of racist intent. And so that's why this is a structural issue and not an individual liability issue, right? So I think that's important to understanding how these structural injustices work, right? So as I say, I think it's it goes to this thinking about sort of wrongs without wrongdoers. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't any wrongdoers in our system, but I do think if you're always looking for some bad guy, we're not going to find it. And so then we have to say, oh, well, these people are there for bad luck, or they're there because they made bad choices. And that's often the frame, I think, at least in the United States, is the reason people have harms from our food system is they just chose badly. And even people like, Michael Pollan, who I respect a lot of his work, but he often frames the discussion around, just pick better food, right? As if we're all in the position to pick that higher quality food that costs more and is not accessible to many people. So after seeing that kind of framing of this, then we get to when we think about the idea that we're not kind of always looking for some sort of bad guy here, but rather we're looking at background structures that lead to these kinds of outcomes, then we need to think about these structured social structures as they're complex, they're varied, and they make up individuals' choice networks, and they often foreclose certain kinds of choices, and leaving them with very little conditions. And one of the things that I argue, and and this is a longer story, so I'll argue it here, is that why this is a question of justice is that in a just society, we want to make sure not that people all have equality of resources. That's not necessarily the goal, that everybody has the same amount of stuff, but that people have this, they have equal opportunities. And so this, what we call, with some, political philosophers call the social conditions of freedom. That is, that we have the ability to act and be certain things are open to us, and not just open in the sense that, well, you could do something, but you don't have any ability to do it. You don't have any opportunity to do it. So it has to be actually something that you could in fact do, right? And so when you see that, then you're arguing that a just society is obligated to ensure that people's capacities for well-being. And again, this is a longer story and drawing on the work of Armetta Sen and Martha Nussbaum of thinking about what it means for people to have capacities to live certain kinds of lives so that they can, exercise and live lives of well-being are the same, right? Again, we're not interested in necessarily those same resources, but just that you have these basic opportunities. And so what I wanted to argue here is that since we live in these societies and presumably we're committed to justice, then who's responsible? We are. It's collective, so it's not backward-looking liability responsibility. So we're not saying we're racist or sexist necessarily, but we're saying as a society committed to justice, then that commitment to justice requires that we take on this collective responsibility to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to exercise the conditions of freedom. And right now, we don't have that in terms of food. So I'll just leave it there and look forward to any discussion of that. And I'm going to move on to Sally.
Thank you, Joan. As I begin talking about women and womanliness, gendered racial food injustices in the United States, I'd like to ask everyone who's hearing me to think about the ways in which food in your family or your social network is linked with gender, race, or ethnicity. So some questions to think about are: who grows the food where you live or the food that you eat? Who sells it? Who's expected to prepare it? Who serves it to children? Who gets to eat it first? Who eats what? Are there men's foods and women's foods? You'll see that there are in the US. Do some foods belong completely to certain ethnic groups or social classes? So those are the kinds of questions that I began my interest in this topic with. It is the case that in most societies, that in most societies, very few social or cultural issues are gender neutral. And certainly food, growing, preparing, desiring, consuming, and even imagining food is one of those issues. It's also important to remember that in the US, gender is always a racialized concept. So as I go through some of these observations, you'll see that I'll be referring to gender and race together. So my presentation offers a kind of glimpse of the gendered racial aspects of food injustice resulting in oppressions in the US context. You'll see that I'll be using a lot of images in the presentation, in part because our culture is flooded with images and advertising related to food, which in turn both creates and expresses gendered expectations and desires, including sexual desires, via food. Food advertising is very prevalent in the United States because the food industry, excuse me, creates 3 times as many food products as our society needs, and therefore they need to advertise a lot to get rid of the stuff they make. And there is also fierce competition between food products and restaurants. So again, I invite you to make comparisons with your own or other societies. So I've divided the many instances of gendered and racial food injustices that I will discuss into 2 major categories. The first are injustices leading to discrimination and oppression in terms of women's roles, behavior, and opportunities. And the second is injustice leading to discrimination and oppression exerted through concepts of womanliness. That is, tying acceptable or desirable female qualities or characteristics to food products and consumption. So the first category, injustice and oppression as women in terms of roles, status, and worth. Now, it's often thought and said that women are natural food providers, particularly to the extent that food is considered part of building relationships and bringing friends and families together. Excuse me again. This is especially strong in some U.S. ethnic and racial communities, such as among African Americans. But food provision is a learned, not an innate skill. Not all women learn it or choose to learn it, but even those who do or even enjoy providing food can both be and feel overburdened by the need to provide food for their families multiple times every day. That burden is exacerbated in certain impoverished communities where food providers may be the last to consume the food, often to the detriment of their own health. In the US, there remains a fine line between relishing the role of food provider and being oppressed by it. We may consider that a parent choice, and I'll refer to what Joan just discussed in terms of the constraints on choices, can become a trap, especially if food becomes the primary language in which a woman is permitted to express herself. Or embracing the role of food provider could reinforce socially unjust gender distinctions and hierarchies, and we'll see some of that in a minute. There's also a gap in the US between female responsibility for providing food and female agency in determining what foods are available, what foods she might have access to or can afford, and how food is distributed around the country. Again, I refer to some of the remarks that Joan just made. In the food industry in the US, women are more likely to be considered food consumers than food producers. So there is a constraint on roles and opportunities, which brings us to the issue of farming. Although more American women are taking up farming, they still have trouble being identified as so-called real farmers, because that role is a highly gendered role as male. This stereotype keeps women from qualifying for financial programs such as farm loans and from being recognized in farming organizations where they are often viewed as farm wives or cheerleaders for male farmers. Now, it is true that more US men, husbands and fathers in particular, are participating in domestic food preparation, which is all to the good. But there are still some downsides. Most cisgender men's domestic food preparation focuses on entertaining, grilling burgers for a party, for example, rather than making sure kids are fed 3 times a day, plus snacks. It's also the case that men have been much more successful in translating their cooking skills into lucrative roles as chefs. This is very visible on TV these days. Women actually find it much harder to achieve that kind of status, even though they may have more skill and experience. As of 2020, fewer than 19% of chefs were women, and that number was about 12% for women of color. So moving on to oppression via notions of womanliness, one of the ways that happens is by defining women through food and diet. There's a racialized standard of beauty in the United States, often based on ideas about thinness, as exemplified by white models and movie stars. Real women, good women, attractive women, eat little, mostly salads. And if they eat salads, their lives will be better, as in this McDonald's ad. They will get new hairdos, new outfits, and be altogether way more attractive and interesting. Now, this standard is oppressive for all women and contributes to eating disorders such as bulimia and anorexia nervosa. Those eating disorders are especially corrosive for minority-race women whose personal trauma via race, which can be very complex, can easily intersect with sociocultural comorbidities as gendered racial stereotyping and racism in the US impact a woman's self-esteem and can create body dysphoria. Food consumption is also connected with alternative sexualities. Lesbians, for example, are stereotyped as masculinized eaters, consuming a diet heavy on meat, as meat is masculinized in American popular imagery, as illustrated in this slide. And it's for that reason that some theorists call meat dude food. Another connection to womanliness is the fact that standards of motherhood, but not fatherhood, are also related to food. Mothers are held responsible for the health and weight of their children. Indeed, the social construction of motherhood is more connected to women's role as food providers than wifehood is. One thing that heterosexual and lesbian women have in common in the US, if their children are overweight or otherwise have an unhealthy diet, it's considered their fault. Here's where lack of agency in food production reappears. Not all mothers have access to healthy food. Again, as Joan was discussing, there are food deserts where only junk food or otherwise unnutritious food is available. And many of these occur in minority communities, as again, making them racialized as well as class related. And then there's the problem of equating women with food, seeing them as food. This form of injustice means that women's identities, social value, attractiveness, and sexiness are expressed or depicted through food. Depictions that mostly reinforce a subordinate or even abject position vis-a-vis men. Now, this happens in a couple of ways. Food can be depicted as a sex substitute or sexual titillator from a male perspective. And it can be that male-initiated sex is depicted as consumption of a willing but passive female object. In other cases, consuming food replicates the phallocentric heterosexual act in which men are the actors and women are the acted upon. The masculinization of meat plays a role in this. And finally, as this slide depicts, women don't even have to be represented or be barely represented for the predatory sexual food relationship to be present. Again, this is especially prevalent in representations of meat consumption. Now, I ask you to look carefully at this slide because, at this image, because it's a little hard to see it clearly. But this is a burger delivery service, I guess we could say. The male figure, because it's COVID, he's wearing a mask, good for him, is carrying a big, heavy burger, and he's delivering it. And can you see to whom he's delivering it and what her position is? All you can really see of her is her nose and her knees. So in US culture and elsewhere, I believe, meat's presence on the table effectively disempowers and silences women, in this case, flattens them on their backs, who become a kind of absent signifier implied in the masculine consumption of flesh. Women are thereby seen as devoured along with the meat, swallowed and swallowers, consumers and consumed. I will now turn time over to Juliann. I think you're muted, Juliann.
Thank you. I was muted. So I'm going to be talking about the ideal Mediterranean diet, a question, and the risk of promoting de-territorialized foodways without cultural context. So my section focuses on the risks associated with a nutritional model, which is considered universal and doesn't take into account different economic, social, environmental contexts, and in particular, racialized and gendered histories. Okay. So in the 1950s, the now famous physiologist from the United States, Ancel Keys, discovered the Mediterranean diet during a research trip to Naples. Then, together with his wife, Margaret Cheney Keys, he popularized that diet in their best-selling advice manual, Eat Well and Stay Well. Ever since, tension has existed between Keys's place-based research and the call for this diet based largely on plant foods, seafood, olive oil, and limited consumption of meat and dairy products to be universally translated to societies with very different geographies, economies, and cultures. Ancel Keys' focus on the nutritional advantages of the diet and the scientific authority substantiating those benefits obscures the historical and ideological reasons for the development of those cultural practices in certain Mediterranean communities, which were the result of subsistent food producers' creativity in the face of poverty, oppression, and the threat of malnutrition. I also wanted to note that Keys knew from his own research that other non-European foodways offered similar benefits, yet dismissed them in the introduction to his book. It is often remarked that Ancel Keys embodied the Mediterranean diet because he lived in a southern Italian region, Cilento, for over 30 years of his life, where he joined the ranks of the community's famous centenarians. Keys, however, lived there with distinct economic, racial, and gender privileges that have been ignored and which certainly facilitated his own access to delicious nutritional food and good health. Due to the historical poverty of southern Italy and the strong racism against Southerners because of their work as farmers in an agricultural economy that afforded them little power over their own lives and futures, Keys could afford oceanfront property, as well as a gardener and a cook to produce his food. His personal chef and housekeeper, Delia Morinelli, was an important source of his knowledge of local foods and recipes, which were often passed down orally through generations of mothers and daughters. Yet Delia Morinelli has only recently received some recognition for her contribution to his research. In interviews, Morinelli and other women of her generation and their daughters explain how women participated in vegetable and wheat production, milled their own flour, made their own breads and pasta, learned to conserve important foods in their culture, such as eggplant and anchovies, and also transported fish and other foods from the seaside to hilltop towns where families practiced terrace farming and produced olive oil. These still shots are from a 1954 documentary that examines the food practices of a small town in the Cilento at roughly the same time that Keys discovered the Mediterranean diet. While the film's visuals emphasize women's labor in food production, Keys obscured the knowledge and experiences of these women by translating their Cilentan traditions into a scientific paradigm. Instead of focusing on the Mediterranean diet as an indigenous set of food practices developed over centuries by peasants, a tradition in which women played a crucial role in production, Ancel Keys created his own mythological roots for his discovery. From his adopted home in the seaside town of Piopi, he could see the ruins of the ancient Greek city of Alia, where there might have existed one of the first schools of medicine in the West. Keys saw himself and other male scientists who joined him in the Cilento as historical heirs to the philosophical and authoritative tradition of Western health based on universal principles rather than material relationships. He combined the names of his home city in the United States, Minneapolis, with that of the ancient Greek city Alea to form the title of his new scientific community, Minalea, although he noted that Minneapolis was a name derived in part from the Dakota word for water. He never considered that the indigenous populations of the United States might have place-based food traditions that were equally worthy of study. With the reduction of Chilento's food system to a nutritional schema that could supposedly be applied to any person in the United States and beyond, the Mediterranean diet lost its historical and geographic context. Starting in the 1990s, and in response to discussions of the United States, excuse me, I don't see the next slide. Now I see it. All right. So starting in the 1990s, and in response to discussions of the United States Department of Agriculture's food pyramid, experts from governmental and non-governmental organizations like Foodways, which includes business interests such as the International Olive Council, successfully linked the scientific construction of the Mediterranean diet to the Med label that represented the interests of the agro-food market. As the scholar Marquis da Silva says, it is clear today that the olive oil lobby made a visionary move with a durable effect. In this way, the process of recognizing the importance of traditional foodways was appropriated to brand certain products, especially olive oil, rather than focusing on the contemporary public health challenges and the racial and gender histories that shape them. Today, Key's notion of the Mediterranean diet as a universal solution for nutritionally based chronic conditions persists despite the dramatic increase of those diseases during the decades long voluminous record of academic studies and their popular promotion. For instance, from 2018 through 2022, the U.S. World and News Report proclaimed the Mediterranean diet as the reigning champion for the best diet of the year by its panel of healthcare professionals, with hundreds of spin-off articles and other news and health publications. Although Ansel Keys' model for the Mediterranean diet was a community of relationships in Chilento in which people, land, water, animals, and plants shared a deep history, media descriptions emphasize individuals and weight loss. It's a tragic irony that the Chilentan variety of the Mediterranean diet, developed through many generations as a form of collective knowledge and practices to deal with evolving challenges, including food scarcity, is now used to promote food restriction, especially for women. The continued promotion of the Mediterranean as the best dietary model brings up several concerns. The first is that the dietary advice is based on a model developed in a largely non-industrialized society 7 decades ago. With the push to imitate food practices that focus on seasonality, fresh rather than processed food, and commensality, eating together, the burden of achieving those nutritional goals often falls on women, as discussed earlier by Joni and Sally, especially mothers, without giving them the resources and the choices, as Joan pointed out, to provide better foods such as flexible work hours, reductions in the gender wage gap, and changes to a welfare system that has pushed many women to low-wage jobs. A second problem is that the Mediterranean diet perpetuates a colonialist hierarchy of traditional diets, tied to the United States' own racialized food histories, in which one, carrying a European or white identity, is considered the best, and because of years of scientific research, has the data-driven backing of scientific authorities, which is often cited in its marketing. Yet many traditions of indigenous and other marginalized communities remain less studied and promoted, even though they also offer plant-based models. As Tina Moffat warns public health professionals, the promotion of the Mediterranean diet could, in fact, have the opposite effect of pushing families to question the health of their own traditional practices, which, especially for migrants and other vulnerable communities, contributes to their overall well-being. In the Southwest of the United States, where we teach, recognizing native food traditions is particularly important at this moment because of the clear nutritional and environmental health inequities among Indigenous peoples that the COVID pandemic has both revealed and exacerbated. The Dene storyteller, Sunny Dooley, narrates in painful detail how the violent colonization of her people's Indigenous culture and territories produced a crisis in their land-based spiritual and food practices, which led to both emotional trauma and chronic physical illness, such as diabetes. She says COVID is revealing what happens when you displace a people from their roots. She also ends her story by posing a question. The truth is disparity of health, well-being, and human value. And now the truth has been revealed. What are we going to do about it? Maria Paracano of Phoenix who identifies as Zicana Indigena, asked a similar question in 2004 when both of her parents were diagnosed with diabetes. As she started to develop nutritionally based chronic illnesses herself, she sought answers to the knowledge. She sought answers within her family's own traditions. Chef Maria applied what she learned at culinary school to the knowledge of Mexico's indigenous food traditions, which she had gained from years of cooking with her mother. Using ingredients native to the Sonoran Desert, she successfully healed her family and herself. They no longer need medications for diabetes. Maria went on to create Sana Sana Foods and Phoenix's Food Forest Cooperative. It's only the second food cooperative in our state, which disseminate her delicious plant-based cuisine together with cooking and agricultural workshops where she passes down her knowledge to the next generation. Maria's work is a powerful example of culturally meaningful place-based food education, which recognizes the importance of diversity to human health. So, the superficial translation of the Mediterranean diet is promoted by agri-food interests, some nutritionists, and the weight loss industry focuses on the universal consumption of olive oil as the proper source of lipids. It also emphasizes individual consumer habits rather than a holistic approach rooted in geographical and cultural relationships. Clearly, the mass exportation of olive oil from Spain and Italy cannot on its own develop healthier food practices in the United States, or even protect traditional practices in the Mediterranean territories producing the olive oil and now facing similar challenges of nutritionally based diseases such as childhood obesity. A better approach is a deep translation that re-territorializes foodways. Re-territorialization means including racial and gender histories in the study and practice of traditional foodways, paying special attention to indigenous food cultures often passed down by women, which have been rendered vulnerable by racial injustice. Seeing the Mediterranean diet as a cluster of distinct land-based and sea-based traditional foodways, which are also facing steep challenges by the industrialized, globalized food system, counters the diet of the year and opens the way to considering indigenous traditions, both those where we live and those that are compatible with various cultural and biological ecologies, as guides towards developing healthier, more equitable, and more sustainably diverse relationships within food systems. I'll pass it on to Sara and Christy.
Thank you so much, Juliann, for sharing that with us. Sara, are you going to take control?
Yeah, I just did. 1 second. I'm trying to go to the next slide. Here we go. Can you see the next slide?
Yep, we're good. We're going to move here from the idea of diet as something that people are being encouraged to eat to maintain a certain form of body, to diet as a set of practices that exist within specific legal structures. And we're going to specifically talk with you, Sara and I are, about food safety and propose that food safety standards actually have the capacity of increasing the level of food injustice or decreasing it. Could you go to the next slide, Sara, please?
Did it go?
Yep. So to get us started, I want to invite you all to think with us about the way that the regulations around food safety shape how people in the United States think about what sorts of foods should or should not be sold, and in turn are thinking about who should or should not be producing that food. So food safety standards would be the regulatory systems that say this is how you should cook something to make it safe. And they often exist, at least in the US, along a binary, dividing the safe from the unsafe. These standards are ordering the world. They're ordering the physical world by saying these materials can be present, but these other materials should be absent. But they're also ordering practices. Now, both Sara and I and all of our colleagues like to be healthy eaters, and we like to be eaters who don't get sick. So we have a lot of respect for these food safety standards. But at the same time, we suspect that these standards have had a disproportionate impact on women's ability to bring food to the market, and more specifically, on the ability of traditional food producers to bring foods that are part of their culture and heritage to the market. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Sara to tell us a little bit more about some research that we conducted specifically around this question.
Thank you, Christy, and thank you all previous speakers. So yeah, as Christy was saying, we try to understand how some of these regulatory structures may be impacting traditional foods. And in specific, we've been conducting research in Arizona, in this case with migrant communities. And we did a number of different case studies with different groups of people. But in specific, what we are going to be mentioning here is Nepali communities that are living in Arizona and who are, producing some of their own foods in the Arizona area, bringing some of their foods from Nepal because they have a yearning for it, or because these are the foods that they grew up with. And so in this case, we are talking specifically about the image illustrated here, which is the process of making gundruk. And gundruk, for those of you who don't know, is a fermented leafy green. It is usually made out of mustard greens, for example, and it comes through a series of different steps. It is a fermented product. I'm assuming that a lot of people in Taiwan and in that area have a lot of different types of fermented products that you are familiar with. So fermentation typically takes place when microorganisms, microbes are in relationship with some kind of food, in this case, these leafy greens. And so they go through this, step-by-step process of drying the greens, sun drying them, then putting them in jars, waiting for the microbes that are on the leaves to actually start digesting and breaking down, releasing different flavors and acids, and then again drying them for another period so that they can store for a long period of time. Now, these products that are traditional products come with their standards of what safety looks like. And so in terms of the Nepali women who are often making them, there is a concept called joto, which are traditional safety regulations. And these may include things like how the hands should be washed, what clothing should be worn, when during the year or during the day you could be producing those foods. And so they do come with their own set of standards and regulations. However, as Sally mentioned at the beginning, foods like these are not really fitting in with an industrialized food system that has its own regulations and has its own standards that rightly, like Christy was saying, has been created to protect us, to protect consumers, to ensure that at scale, as foods are being produced, that people do not get sick. However, what we discovered through our conversations and through the case studies that we explored is that this means that these kinds of productions, and Gundruk being one example, often get excluded from ever accessing a market. They could not be products that could be sold in a market. And so in that kind of exploration of trying to understand food safety, we also did another exercise where we tried to look at what is the language, the lexicon that is talked about when we talk about food safety. And so we conducted a literature review of newspaper articles that are specifically published between 2011 and 2019 in Arizona. And again, these were mostly newspaper articles. We focused on keywords that kind of captured the idea of food safety. So food, contamination, fermentation, probiotics. We tried to make it expansive so that to try and explore what kind of articles we would find. And what we found, and what is highlighted in this word cloud that is in front of you right now, is that often the language that is being used to talk about food safety actually has a lot of negative connotations. There's a negative lexicon, especially as it relates to bacteria. So bacteria are often seen as negative. They are part of an outbreak. They are, specifically in Arizona, we've had quite a few of these E. coli outbreaks that are related to romaine lettuce. And so there's a negative kind of connotation that goes with microbes. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. And so this creates an understanding around, people of microbes not necessarily being something good, but rather being something that you want to get rid of, a certain binary that they create of not wanting microbes to be part of our food. And yet a lot of traditional foods actually have microbes being part of their processing, as we saw with Gundruk and can see with other types of traditional productions. And so what we try to make the case for in our paper is, how can we start thinking about things like microbes in our food in a way that actually introduces or includes traditional practices, but brings those in to the narrative and to the lexicon. And so just by quickly analyzing the different steps that are taken in producing Gundruk, there are actually a lot of them where they do think about, how this process is being made and making sure that it's done safely. So the steps include washing the leaves very well, and then they are left to wilt in the sun. They're covered with a light mesh. Again, this is to protect from insects and to avoid rot. The leaves are then cut up into very small pieces so that you can increase the surface area, squeezing out any excess liquid. Again, as food safety step. The leaves are then put into an airtight container to avoid other kinds of microbes.
可以啊，你那个可以调，不是吗？
Sorry?
怎么了？
Someone saying something? Oh, okay. Sorry. So I was saying to create a fermentation process with the microbes that are in the jar. There's testing that's done halfway through. This is like a tacit knowledge that women will have of understanding whether this is suitable to continue eating or not. And then it's finally sun-dried one more time, again on a light mesh to remove any remaining liquids. And then this can be used to create these delicious hearty meals, soups and salads and so forth. And so what we're saying is that there are ways for this to be done safely. They just don't fit within the industrial system. And I'm going to pass this on to Christy to finish us off.
Thank you, Sara. So again, I want to emphasize, we're not saying that health standards or food safety standards should be thrown out. Rather, we're looking at the ways in which, as foods circulate from one location to another location in combination with people migrating, that there needs to be a way to reconsider current regulatory practices so that they can allow for other forms of evaluating and thinking about food safety, forms that are themselves deeply embedded in cultures, to continue to thrive in these new locations. And we think that one of the ways that this could happen is to really focus in on this concept of microbes, not just as a threat, but also as potential companions, as beneficial beings that exist. And I see in the chat on the side of my Zoom screen the suggestion that on your post-conference field trip, perhaps you could try some fermented fish. And I know from teaching my own courses where we ferment together, there's always a risk when you choose to eat something that is, no matter what, when you choose to eat something. But entering into this eating conversation in a way that recognizes that food safety has multiple aspects, and some of those aspects are not just scientific, but also cultural. And to reach that point, Sara and I suggest that what is really needed is a refocusing, for example, of how we measure food safety's presence. Currently, the tools available in the United States for evaluating whether a food is safe are entirely looking at the presence of dangerous bacteria, but there are no systems capable yet of really measuring the presence of beneficial bacteria. And we're intrigued to imagine what might a future food safety system look like, where there are tests that would help a producer at home determine that the food she has made in a culturally appropriate way is also safe, that she could bring it and sell it at our local farmers market, and that she could collaborate with other producers to make this a business for her. So thank you. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the baton over to Mauricio.
Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate all of the presentations, and in my turn, I'm going to discuss a little bit about design and how we can consider food systems and food artifacts as design, as things that we can design or were designed somehow. So I want to make a distinction between micro level design and macro level design. So you see something like in this picture, a packaging of school food, you can see that these things were designed. I mean, a graphic designer or an industrial designer was able to create these things, and probably some of the things that were done were desirable, like trying to appeal to kids with doing these comics or colorful graphics. But there are things that are not very desirable, like highly processed foods or unhealthy items because they have a lot of sugar or carbohydrates. At the macro level, just thinking about this same image, we can imagine that there is somebody like a school manager or a policymaker in education making decisions about this, about what food could be transported easily, or what are the economics of this? Is it going with the budget that we have? We can buy food for all kids or not? So that's the macro level design. When you're thinking about policies, systems, services that influence or are designed for this larger level elements. So some things are preferred. Yes, it's easy to transport. Some maybe the budget is or the economics of this work, but some other things maybe are less desirable. Maybe there is a lack of proteins in these foods. There is these are not whole foods that could be better for the kids, or there are more cultural elements or cultural satisfactors in these foods for minorities. So when we talk about design theory, there is a concept or a definition that when we design something, we are devising preferred situations. And this is true for the most part in many examples, like the food packaging or food systems for the schools. But the problem with this is that typically the decision makers or the designers of these systems and this packaging are thinking mostly in economic terms or technical terms. So again, if you think about the packaging or these food items, so you want to make them visually appealing, easy to transport, which is a technical concept, or easy to preserve in a fridge or in the schools, and this is a technical issue. So an economic issue. So yes, they are devising a preferred situation economically and technically, but when it comes to health and justice, maybe is not so desirable. So again, this happens in the micro level, like a packaging, but it also happens in the policy level, like making decisions about how many schools are going to distribute food. So what we suggest in our work is how we can have a more critical and systemic approach to design. Again, from simple products like packaging to more complex artifacts like systems or services. So critical and systemic design could be a good approach, because when you have a critical design, it's about questioning norms. So the idea of a critical review of what is happening and asking questions and see what are the norms, and just making sure that we are not just doing the same things and cover everything. Critical design is also about being aware of political issues and assuming a political position and actually acting politically in the design decisions. And looking at systemic design is this idea that when you design even a simple packaging, you have to understand the complexity of the situation. So systemic design is about doing, of course, research and understanding that complexity before you design anything. And also the idea of anticipating in collaboration. So anticipation is the idea that you don't design something for right now, but what could happen in the future. So there is a futures component there that is needed. And then the idea of collaboration is that, yes, when we design a packaging or when we design a food policy, typically we leave this to experts, but we have to collaborate with minorities, we have to collaborate with the stakeholders to make design decisions in the process. So we have come up with some principles for critical and systemic design of designing food systems, but also food artifacts at the micro level. So the first one is on top, stakeholder collaboration. And basically this principle is this idea that we shouldn't design as a elite of experts making the decisions, but we have to start talking to communities, have to start talking to other stakeholders to make these decisions. Again, so going back, for example, what Joan was saying, there are many things that are structural, and there is not like a bad guy that we can find, but in any level, in any decision that might be simple, we have to start collaborating and talking with communities to make sure that we are not doing wrong. So the second one is complex sense making, and this one is basically trying to apply design here would be using visualization techniques and reframing thinking to make sure that we understand the complexity of the situation. Again, if you are a policymaker in food systems, you might be thinking, okay, my challenge is how I make the budget work and and how I make sure that there is easy transportation of this food. but then that's not addressing all of the complexity of the issues. You have to include other issues like cultural issues, health, sustainability. And then when you are aware of that complexity, you are going to have better food systems. The third one is political awareness. And this is because sometimes we say, okay, this is, if I am a policymaker thinking about the school food, this is a technical problem that I have, or maybe an economic problem that I have, but there is a political component there. So any designer, from packaging to services to policies, has to be aware of the politics of the situation and be willing to take bold actions to make sure that there is justice and sustainability. The fourth one is technological limitations, and this is a very important one because there is a tendency in contemporary society to think that everything can be solved with technology. So we can say that, oh, we can develop a technology for agricultural systems to make sure that we deliver the food that is needed. Or we can use persuasive technologies to make sure people is nudged to eat a Mediterranean diet. But technology has limitations. We have to go beyond that and think about care, respect, relational ideas of culture, and so on. And the last one is future visions. The idea of future visions is this idea that we should not design just for the present or for the immediate future. We have to think longer term and consider and anticipate what potential injustice we can create with a decision, even from just packaging or even just for a policy, even a school district. Future visions can help us prevent unintended consequences. And with that, I finish, and I think I'm going to pass it to Sally to explain what we are going to do next.
Actually, we're going to move to Juliann. Who will begin talking about the ways that these design principles apply to the injustices and oppressions that we have identified. So, Juliann.
You are on mute, Juliann.
Oh, I did it twice. So we wanted to open a discussion about how the principles for a critical and systemic design approach relate to your context, to the context in which you're working and you're living. And I'm going to start the discussion just by talking about two of the principles that I think relate particularly to my research on nutritional models. So, connecting the principle of stakeholder collaboration with the development of political awareness, specifically about ethnic, racial, and gender hierarchies, could make a difference in terms of nutritional education. So if decisions about school lunches and food education made by agencies and institutions without public engagement today could involve local stakeholders to better reflect the cultural and biological diversity of the community. And in addition, if national guidelines in the US for school meals could incentivize programs that provide time and space for children to share and explore the cultural and social practices connected to different indigenous and translocal traditions within their communities. And then also in a similar way, if health agencies could involve diverse local stakeholders in developing materials related to nutritional education and move away from the idea of one model, such as the Mediterranean diet. And if public policy could incentivize agencies to support indigenous and translocal food educators, such as Chef Mejía, whom I talked about earlier. So the traditions that have been marginalized and racialized to the detriment of their community's health receive the attention they deserve. Those were the principles that I thought most related to the work I'm doing, and we're very curious to know what you all think of these principles and how you think they might function in your research and your lives in different regions and different contexts.
While we're waiting for some other comments, I'll mention that the problems that I was alluding to in my talk have to do with stakeholders in part. And so the expansion of stakeholders, in this case, women, especially in the area of food production, would make a very big difference. And seeing all stakeholders as equally participatory would also make a difference. And in addition, the complex sense making helps us make connections that aren't necessarily obvious. In the research that I did about women farmers, I recognize a lot of people are recognizing that expanding farmers, the community of farmers to include women, would actually improve environmentally friendly farming practices in the United States because of the practices that many women farmers are engaging in, those who are already in practice. And so we could not only improve ecology, we could also improve diets, the kinds of dietary distinctions, particularly meat consumption. That sort of thing can be addressed through expanding the stakeholders in the food production processes and deindustrializing those processes to allow alternative food production practices to happen would have multiple benefits. But maybe we have a question. Okay.
Oh, there is a question, and there's also one in the chat. But
okay. Xenia has her hand.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Yours is one of the designated by the organizing committee, the highlight online session for this Food Future Conference. It's so amazing, illuminating, inspirational, and I would like to offer my profuse thanks and on behalf of my colleagues here in Taiwan to the ASU team. It's amazing, to see how you collaborate and how you pull together your research outcome, not only from the text, but also from the field sites, and how you integrate them and then publish an article together, and then now present all together, to the Taiwanese audience and beyond. And it's really amazing to see how you can, offer some sort of vision and future for us to ponder on, for our, common food justice to come. So thank you so much for that. And you have all my admiration. I pay homage to you. So after all this, I think people are going to move to ASU. You have amazing team. So I have two questions. How is this transdisciplinary or kind of interdisciplinary work possible? In other words, for the literature person, we focus on text. For history person, like historian, or you focus on, anything, archival research. And for social scientists, and I believe there are researchers from design studies, science and technology, you use different models, different critical models, different methodologies. How are you going to integrate all these different critical models so that you come up with a common article and then a kind of, very coherent presentation of this panel? It's amazing. So how do you make it? And then how much time, you have been networking, with each other to come up with this fruit? And the second question is that with all this amazing research outcome, what we are thinking about is that this is not just research. This is not just experiment from the laboratories or from any localized or kind of community, but rather we would like to make it known to the world. How are you going to disseminate the seeds that you have already planted, through this amazing teamwork? In other words, through some sort of narratives, tell touching stories to people so that people join you and feel the kind of enthusiasm and action that you have been taken on. So what kind of approach that you will be taking in order to not only, limited this into kind of research, but rather a kind of, societal engagement, and that can be, seen throughout the world as a model story. In other words, is there a story that is big enough? As you say, there are local differences, but I see a lot of universal core values in your presentation. How can we pass it on to people from other communities? But thank you so much.
Do you go?
I was just going to say that one of the advantages that we have at ASU is that we're all already interdisciplinary in our thinking. If you delved into the affiliations that we all have, and Joni gave you an idea of that, you would find out that we work across these disciplinary boundaries almost all the time, and we've done it for years. Joni, Joan, and I, for example, have been working for more than 10 years on various things across these lines. And so we're eager to share with each other and learn from each other as we modify our own interests. I don't think we approach it as like silos standing together. We've opened those doors long ago. And so that enables us, I think, to do things that might seem more difficult to people in other contexts.
May I speak to this from a slightly different research perspective? So, although it wasn't explicitly intended, the design values that Mauricio has highlighted here have played a core role in some research that I am doing with a graduate student colleague, looking at the way we talk about the taste of water in Arizona. We're at a pretty critical sustainability transition. We don't have enough water, and, to say the least. And so many of the municipal utilities are trying to figure out how to raise the money and convince local folks here that they should support moving to a water recycling system where the water would be directly returned, go from wastewater directly back into the drinking water system. And we've been using these design principles to think with multiple stakeholders and try and have the community be part of this process. So while we don't have a specific set of folks we would call food designers, we've reached out to community members who are most resistant to drinking municipal drinking water, to bring them in and imagine with us what a future could look like where they want to drink that water, and doing so within the technological limitations that our systems have. So while we haven't yet hit all 5 of these things, we're working towards them. And I think your question has highlighted for me that I already have the tools, because of this collaboration with my colleagues here, to really talk about this in a useful way. So thank you.
I think there's a question in the chat which I could address if no one else would like to. Okay, so the question the question is asking about whether ASU is implementing any food education programs to improve students' food literacy in relation to the SDGs and zero hunger. And as a follow-up, are there any methods that we're following up with to engage policymakers and so forth? So this is a very interesting conversation, actually, and one that I've been very closely monitoring since I started working, which is not very long ago, like about a month ago. But so ASU is actually, in terms of ranking, there is, you know, a global ranking for sustainability that follows the SDGs, and ASU this year actually got to be second in the world in terms of reaching sustainability development goals as an institution following the higher institution ranking model that exists. And that is in relation to energy programs that we create, in relation to transportation things that we do. So there's a big slew of different things that are being monitored. But what's interesting is, even though we're second as in terms of an institution, in that when you look at the zero hunger element, we rank 49 in the world. So we do not do very well on the hunger issue, and we do not do very well on the hunger issue on campus, unfortunately. It is not a very attractive part of US institutions. This is, again, another you know, aspect that doesn't get talked about very much, which is that there is about between 25 to 35% hunger on university campuses across the United States. Yet there hasn't been a comprehensive study done by the federal government to kind of assess what the real numbers are of food insecure students on university campuses. So there's a lot of different initiatives that are taking place across the country. ASU is also engaged with some of these conversations, but both Joan and I are actively involved locally in Arizona to try and change some of these policies, at least at the school levels, not at the university levels. And it's a big, unfortunate battle that we're having. Not a lot of funding is being allocated to some of these conversations. The narrative is changing in that students are now starting to speak up more. So for example, on our campus, we have about 100,000 students, and we have only one food pantry that is student run. And up until 2020, there might have been about 20 students who made use of it, would come, you know, about 20 students a month would come and utilize it. But after COVID, the numbers went up to 600 students a month. And that's just in terms of like really needing food access. So that group in particular, and a number of other organizations, a lot of them student-led, have been trying to push for this narrative to really start changing and to start thinking about how we can engage policy in different ways. So short answer is ASU might be on the top for sustainability, but hunger is not on the priority list, unfortunately, but we're going to get there.
So as the moderator, I will say thank you to Sara for that really deep answer. It's really interesting, you know, to contrast those things, the high rating on SDGs, but then the low rating, you know, for food security on campus. And that's probably something all campuses should be thinking about. We're out of time, but I think we have one more question. And so if everyone could stay just for one more question from Professor Yiping, that would be great. So Yiping, the floor is yours.
I really, Joni, I really don't have a question. I have a story to tell. This is really to follow up on Xinya's comments with regard to stories and then narratives. Is that okay? Or I'll just pass?
Yes. I think it would be great to go out of the session with a story. So yes, please.
Okay, wonderful. So I am Yiping Liang. I am a local scholar. I teach at National Taiwan Normal U, and I study ethnic American lit. So like, Woman Warrior, Leslie Merman Silgo, Toni Morrison, Gloria Anzaldúa, so on and so forth. But anyway, I would like to tell a story that's written by a Taiwanese writer, and his name is Huang Chunming. And he is like Max Kingston, Toni Morrison, Gloria, and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to say is that Huang Chunming is really a local, well-established, canonized writer, and he published a story which was in 1972, and everyone knows that. Okay, it's called The Taste of the Apple, and so apples immediately comes to the mind of our food. So this is a food narrative, and then the storyline is simple. It's basically a rural sales and construction worker who has moved the family to the north and started to work in the north in the big city. However, he was unfortunately hit by a limousine driven by an American officer. The story took place back in the 1970s. So the officer and other people came to the hospital to see the construction worker and offered to the family a basket of apples. And that's basically what it means. So when the family people, mothers and children, ate the apple, and they were like, oh my goodness, this is the apple, because they were from the south, and the apple at the time was very expensive. So the apple at the time, was really, all of us growing up in the south back in the 70s in Taiwan, we understood, the apples were luxury items. So the apple, the food narrative, okay, used in literature as a metaphor that indicates the discrepancy or the entire system of food injustice. I remember in our family, we share one single apple, among the family members, and that's how expensive, how luxurious, and how inconceivable that you are eating an apple back in the time when Taiwan, our home island, was in the process of this transformation from rural rice paddy. We're going to see that wonderful documentary about alternative rice paddies, rice farming in Yilan on day 2 of the conference, and how the story back in the historical context of the 1970s, using the apple, using the food narrative to indicate the system of food injustice between the so-called continental nations and other non-continental areas or regions. So I guess this would be a wonderful footnote to response to Xinya, and also a footnote to this wonderful transdisciplinary panel put together by our wonderful colleague from ASU, but also with a local touch, with a local taste. So that's my offering. Thank you.
Thank you, Yiping. I see that we do have one more question. I'm not sure of the name of the person. Yeah, could you help us?
Yes, it's Rose.
Yes.
Rose, it's
Right.
Rose.
Yeah, Rose.
Okay, so let's
Professor Ran.
let's go to Professor Wan.
I would like to quickly add something to Yiping's story. I think those apples were not from the south. It's imported from America. And so,
so yeah, that's a punchline.
That's the punchline.
And so it has to do with my question in the chat box and about Western food narratives and food practices, especially American way. And so it's very powerful. It's influential to the food ways, to the food consumptions, or imagining in Taiwan and other countries. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That's the story, and the fact that the apples came from America, and this panel was formed in America, and we were talking about injustices in America. It's so beautiful. So thank you so much for all the amazingly good questions that elicited these amazing answers. But it's really nice to go out of the panel with this story from Professor Liang and Professor Yuan. So thank you so much, and we'll see you this afternoon at, I believe, 2 p.m. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, Rose.
Wonderful.
Joni.
Thank you.
Thank you.